On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the U.S. military is relying on a fleet of 45-year-old vessels to take it to war. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode, coming to you from the beautiful intercoastal waterway here in North Carolina. Well, the Department of Transportation just announced the awarding of a new set of contracts for the operation of what's called the Ready Reserve Force. This is a fleet of 51 vessels that is used by the Department of Defense to transport military equipment during the surge phase of a conflict, vital to the United States. However, the contracts for these ships are awarded once every 10 years, and this new contract comes in at $6.2 billion for the operation of these vessels. But these vessels, as I note, are pretty old. The average age is 45 years old. We're going to go through the awarding of the contracts and discuss each of the vessels. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be alerted about new videos as they come out. So these contracts to companies involve the crewing, the repair, the maintenance, and the activation of these ships in time of war. The crewing companies that operate these ships are responsible for maintaining them, keeping a minimal crew on board, about 9 or 10 people. Usually you would have about 30 on board. The ships are maintained in what's called ROS 5. That's reduced operating status, 5 days. In other words, from the moment the order comes out, they have 5 days to activate the vessel. They would then sail those vessels to ports and load equipment. The ships are about evenly split, about a third on the West Coast, a third on the Gulf Coast, and a third on the East Coast. Now, the Ready Reserve Force was created back in 1977. The envisionment of the Ready Reserve Force came out of the Vietnam War. I did a whole book on this where I talk about the Ready Reserve Force and Sealift in the Vietnam War. But the idea was during the Vietnam War, because there was a lack of shipping back in 1965, the U.S. military broke ships out of what was then called the National Defense Reserve Fleet. This was a massive fleet of vessels left over from World War II. Well, there was problems with activating those ships. There were a lot of problems. As a matter of fact, there was actually lives lost with accidents. So after the Vietnam War, they decided to take 30 victory ships, put them into this higher status called the Ready Reserve Force. Now, they were going to use victory ships, but then they found out, wait a minute, we've got newer ships than World War II era victory ships. And so they started buying vessels from shipping companies that didn't need their ships anymore. As the U.S. was still building vessels at the time under the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, the construction and operational differential subsidies, companies were turning in their older ships so that they can build newer ships. And this was a great process. The problem was in the 1980s, we ended that process. And now what we have in the Ready Reserve Force is a batch of vessels that were bought on the open market, largely foreign built, but very old. The average age of the ships is 45 years old. I mean, when you get to the point where you can start, being a member of AARP, that's a problem when you're planning on using those ships to take you off to war. So there was a series of 7 companies that were awarded these contracts: Keystone, Sunrise Vessel, Pacific Gulf, Tote, Patriot, Ocean Duchess, and Crowley. We're going to break down each of those companies and what ships they got, where they're located, and what does this mean. So the first company is Keystone. Keystone received 12 vessels. I had an opportunity to go down to Florida a few years ago and give a talk to Keystone during their annual conference. It was a great time. They received 12 vessels, 5 Cape Ds. They are down in Charleston along with the Cape Edmont. Now, one of those vessels is going to be laid up soon. It just hasn't been identified which one of them. They're also going to get the 3 Cape Rs. The Cape Rs are up in Norfolk. One of those vessels is going to be laid up soon also. And then in 2 separate group contracts, they received the Bob Hope and then the Britain and the Fisher. Now, those ships are out on the west coast of the United States. Those are large, medium-speed roll-on, roll-off vessels. At the end of the first Persian Gulf War, there was a identification done that we did not have enough strategic sea lift. And so the plan was made to build or convert 20 large, medium-speed roll-on, roll-off vessels. And the reason they have that weird name is because the study looked at large, small, and medium-sized vessels, and it looked at slow, medium, and fast roll-on, roll-off vessels. And we decided on going big and medium speed. And 3 of those new builds, the Bob Hope, the Britain, and the Fisher, are going to be awarded over to Keystone. Next, we have the 2 Cape Ws, the Washington and the Wrath, going over to Sunrise Vessel. And that's a new company. First time they're getting an operating contract. I don't know much about them. They're out in San Rafael, California. But the two ships they get, the Wrath and the Washington, are up in Baltimore. I know these ships very well. Back when I came ashore for the U.S. military and worked at Military Sealift Command, I was the operations officer for the Army Prepositioning Program. And 2 Cape W's, 2 of the Cape D's, and 3 Cape H's, along with a crane ship, were all activated. So I have some good knowledge of a lot of these vessels. The Cape W's up in Baltimore are converted pure car and truck carriers. Next company is Pacific Gulf. They got 6 ships through 3 different group contracts. They get the 2 Cape K's, the Knox and the Kennedy, down in New Orleans, and then the 4 crane ships, 2 on each coast. You get the Cornhusker and the Gopher State. Then you get the Keystone and the Gem State on the West Coast. Now, the crane ships were initially envisioned to be a class of 12 different vessels, cut down to 10, and now, over time, there's just 4 remaining. They were very old in the tooth, in the 60s. Container ships, very small container ships. They were designed with these large outstretched cranes so that they could offload other container ships in ports that were damaged either due to natural disaster or war. The problem with these crane ships today is their cranes can't go across modern container ships. They're just too small, but they're used extensively for moving munitions, for moving cargo. A lot of these have been used to haul cargo over to Europe for Ukraine and for Israel. Most recently, the Gopher State was used for a resupply of the USS Farragut to test reloading their vertical launch cells. Next company is Tote. Tote comes away with 14 vessels, the biggest single award to a company. Now, they get the 3 Cape T's. Those are all down in Beaumont, Texas. They get the 4 remaining fast sealift ships. Now, fast sealift ships used to be a class of 8 vessels. These ships were the bulwark of strategic sealift for a long time. These ships, capable of about 35 knots, designed and built for Sealand back in the 70s. Malcolm McLean had this idea for a fast transatlantic service using these ships hyper-fueled up. The problem is it came just as the fuel crisis hit. And so those ships became uneconomical. They sold them to the military. They converted them into fast sealift ships. They inserted a mid-body for a roll-on, roll-off deck. And throughout the First Persian Gulf War, the Iraq War, and repeatedly since then, they've been used extensively. They're just old now. They're over 50 years old, and now they're being laid up. Envisioning all of the fast sealift ships to be gone by 2026. Tote also gets 2 ships that are not technically in the Ready Reserve Force, but they're operated by the Maritime Administration. And this is the Pacific Collector and the Pacific Tracker. One's a modified sonar surveillance vessel. The other is a former crane ship. They are used by the U.S. to monitor and track missile launches, domestic missile launches. U.S. military, the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command, has vessels that do that to track foreign launches. These are used for domestic launches, largely in the Pacific. Tote has 2 of the oldest large medium-speed ro-ros left. These are up in Baltimore. This is the Gordon and the Gilliland. These are 2 of the 5 converted LMSRs. Now, 3 of those are gone, or 2 of them are gone. One's about to go away. These are the 2 remaining conversions. Back in the 1990s, when I was at Military Sealift Command, we had this serious discussion with the military, Naval Sea Systems Command, about building versus converted. They had this crazy idea that they thought that converting ships would be faster than building them. I disagreed with them, and unfortunately, they didn't listen. And instead, what we got were ships that were already, built in the 70s and 80s being converted in the 90s. And Gordon and Gilliland probably won't be around that long. On the flip side, Tote did get 3 of the newest ships in the fleet, the 3 Cape S's, the Cape Star, the Cape Sable, and the Cape San Juan. These ships are being based out on the West Coast. These are massive ships. These are huge. These are big builds. There's 2 others that are going to be coming online shortly. Not sure who's going to get them yet. But those ships are big. Former Messina Lines, Italian vessels, built a little bit over a decade ago. The only thing about them is when the U.S. government bought them, we actually paid more for them used than Messina Lines paid for them new. They're a bit of an expensive buy for the U.S. Costs us between $90 to $110 million to buy and convert those vessels. Next is Patriot Lines. Now, Patriot got 7 ships for them, 2 Cape V's down in Beaumont, Texas. Then they got 2 kind of oddball vessels, one-of-a-kind vessels. One is the Admiral William M. Callahan. This is a ship built back in the mid-1960s. It's unique because she is a gas turbine ship. Matter of fact, not only is she a gas turbine ship, she has the very first 2 LM2500 gas turbines on board, the same LM2500s that are used by the US military today in US Navy destroyers and everywhere. They have the very first two, and those gas turbines are so good that you keep the Callahan around. They also get the motor vessel Cape Orlando, a one-off vessel. This ship made the news not too long ago when it sailed from Tacoma, Washington over to Israel to return an Iron Dome system. There were a lot of protests about that vessel. And then they have the three Cape H's, ships that are dear to my heart, the Hudson, the Horn, and the Henry, two of which are out on exercises right now. These are big vessels. They're kind of akin to the Cape S's. These are great vessels, big, huge roll-on, roll-off vessels, massive stern ramps on them, just all around great ships. Then we have Ocean Duchess, and Ocean Duchess has 6 vessels, although that's about to go down. They get the 4 Cape I's. Now, 2 of them were up in Tacoma, Washington, 2 down in Long Beach. But one of the vessels up in Tacoma, the Cape Intrepid, just went through the Panama Canal and actually is heading to Beaumont, Texas as we speak, the Cape Intrepid, and she is going to be laid up and taken out of service. One of the reasons you're hearing about these ships being taken out of service is a lot to do with spare parts to keep the other ships up and running, because again, these are older vessels and a lot of the parts for these vessels don't exist anymore. And then the last 2 vessels they have are the Wright and the Curtis. SS Wright and Curtis were designed and converted from container ships for use by the U.S. Marine Corps. That's right, the Marine Corps have their own vessels. These are aviation logistics support ships. They are designed to support a Marine aviation wing or Marine air wing when it's deployed. Now, these ships also very old, need replacement, but one are on each coast. The Wright's on the East Coast, the Curtis on the West Coast. The last company is Crowley. Crowley has 4 ships. They got 2 of the newest ships bought into the Ready Reserve Force under the recapitalization plan, the Cape Cortez and the Cape Arundel. These are former pure car and truck carriers operated by American roll-on, roll-off carriers. Those ships went through an extensive reflagging, a lot of issues associated with getting them up and running. And then they have 2 of the large medium-speed roll-on, roll-off vessels, Viedes and Mendonca, both in Norfolk. Now, this is the awarding of all 51 contracts. It's 20 different groups to 7 companies. I can almost guarantee you there's going to be protests and fights about this. No one's going to be happy with these awards. Everybody's going to think that they should have gotten more ships or different ships. But I just wanted to highlight who is operating these vessels. Now we can expect some more ships entering in here. There are 2 more Cape S's that are on deck here, the Cape San Roman and Cape Suarez Point, and then 6 former U.S. Army large medium-speed roll-on, roll-off ships that are being phased out of service. We can expect to see them turned over from Military Sealift Command over to the Ready Reserve Force. But the big issue here is that we're depending more and more on these elderly vessels to surge our sealift in time of war. There's a big problem with trying to reactivate vessels that are not just 10 or 20 years old, but 40 to 50 years old. That's what we're talking about in the fleet right now. So we need to do this. Now, under the big, beautiful bill, as it was referred to, there is money set aside. There's $600 million to buy new vessels or used vessels in the open market. But what we really need to be doing is starting to build vessels in U.S. shipyards for replacement. Remember, the goal of the Ready Reserve Force, when it was set out in 1977, was to take vessels that are U.S. flagged, take the older vessels from the U.S. companies, bring them into the Ready Reserve Force so that the U.S. companies would build new ships in U.S. shipyards and put them back out to sea. The problem is, in 1981, we ended that program right after we started the Ready Reserve Force. And what we've seen is the Ready Reserve Force, instead of housing the leftovers from a U.S.-built, U.S.-flagged merchant marine, are being filled with ships that are bought on the open market that are foreign-built and have to be reflagged into the U.S. merchant fleet. This is a big problem when the U.S. wants to become a major sea power and be able to project the Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Navy overseas, because you need sealift vessels to do it. Overwhelming amount of these vessels are roll-on, roll-off ships, ships you drive on, drive off. There are some crane ships, 4 crane ships as I talked about. There are the 2 aviation logistics support ships. What we haven't talked about and what's missing from this fleet are tankers. There are no reserve tankers in the fleet. So we need to be thinking about it. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the view here from beautiful North Carolina on the Intercoastal Waterway. If you enjoyed today's video, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You can hit the super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. I'm going to go put ice in my arm because I've been holding my arm up here for quite a while because this is actually my second take doing this. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.